When my father died, my whole world fell apart. I was only 19 and still trying to understand what life meant without him. He had always been kind, soft-spoken, and protective. The house we lived in, the big Westwood estate, used to feel full of warmth and laughter. But after his funeral, that warmth disappeared overnight. My stepmother, Caroline, changed completely. At first, she acted like she cared. She told me things would be okay, that we'd take care of each other. But soon her words turned sharp. She said I was old enough to work for my stay, that she couldn't afford to feed someone who just sat around crying. It hurt, but I thought maybe grief was making her say cruel things. So, I stayed quiet and tried to help around the house. A week later, I came back from running errands to find my bedroom door locked. My clothes were in boxes outside the door. Caroline stood there with a cold smile and said, "You can sleep in the kitchen. It's closer to where you should be anyway." I didn't understand at first. I thought it was a bad joke, but she was serious. That night, I lay on a small mattress near the old stove. The air smelled like burned wood and cleaning supplies. I could hear Caroline and her daughter, Madison, laughing in the dining room upstairs. I held the photo of my dad close to my chest and tried not to cry. I told myself he wouldn't want me to give up, that somehow things would get better. Every morning, I woke up before sunrise to cook breakfast for them. I scrubbed the floors, did the laundry, and cleaned rooms I wasn't even allowed to enter. Caroline watched me like a hawk, always looking for something to criticize. If I missed a spot or forgot to serve her coffee the way she liked it, she'd remind me, "You're lucky I'm letting you stay here at all." Madison wasn't any better. She was a few years older than me and loved showing off her fancy clothes. Sometimes she'd walk into the kitchen just to mock me. "You look so cute down here, Cinderella," she'd say, laughing as she walked away. I tried not to react. I learned that silence was my only way to survive in that house. At night, when they were asleep, I'd sit by the small window near the sink and stare at the stars. I'd whisper, "Dad, I miss you. I wish you were here." There was no one else to talk to. I had no friends left. Caroline made sure of that. She told the staff I wasn't to be spoken to unless necessary. Still, I stayed. I had nowhere else to go, and a small part of me hoped she'd change her heart. But deep down, I could feel something wasn't right, something my father had never told me. And I was about to find out just how much Caroline had been hiding from me. The Westwood estate used to be a place full of love and comfort. Evelyn remembered how her father built it with his own hands, room by room, always saying it was their forever home. But now, every corner of the mansion felt like a reminder of what she had lost. Caroline had taken full control, walking around like a queen who owned everything. The laughter and warmth that once filled the halls were gone, replaced by cold silence and the sound of her footsteps echoing through the marble floor. Evelyn's days followed the same cruel routine. She woke up before dawn, lit the fire, and started cooking breakfast. By the time Caroline and Madison came down, she had already cleaned the living room, dusted the furniture, and laid the table perfectly. Caroline would barely acknowledge her. Sometimes she would just inspect the plates, point out a tiny flaw, and say, "Do it again." Evelyn never argued. She just kept working quietly, knowing that talking back would only make things worse. Madison, on the other hand, treated the house like her own stage. She wore expensive clothes, clicked her heels across the polished floor, and made sure Evelyn could see the difference between them. "Some people are born to shine," she once said with a smirk. "Others are meant to clean up after." It stung every time, but Evelyn bit her tongue. The only comfort she found was when she was alone in the kitchen, away from their eyes. The kitchen became both her shelter and her prison. It was where she worked, ate, and slept. She had a small space near the stove, barely big enough for her mattress and a folded blanket. Some nights were freezing, especially when the fire burned out early. She would pull her thin blanket tighter and stare at the ceiling, trying to remember what her father's voice sounded like. Sometimes she thought she could almost hear him say, "You're stronger than this, Evie. Don't let them break you." Even though she felt trapped, she didn't stop caring for the house. She polished the silverware, trimmed the garden, and made sure her father's favorite rose bushes stayed alive. She did it not for Caroline, but for him, for the memory of the man who had loved her. Every time she walked past his study, she paused for a moment. The door was locked now, but she could still picture him inside, writing letters, humming to himself, calling her "my little sunshine." At night, when the lights in the mansion went out, Evelyn whispered to herself, "Dad wouldn't have wanted this." It became her small act of defiance, a way to hold on to hope. She believed one day, somehow, the truth would come out. She didn't know when or how, but deep inside, she could feel it. This wasn't how her story was meant to end. Evelyn still remembered the night before her father passed away. He was weak but held her hand and said softly, "No matter what happens, this will always be your home." Those words had stayed in her heart like a promise carved in stone. It was the only thing that kept her going when life in the mansion became unbearable. But that promise began to break the night Caroline tore down his portrait. It happened after dinner. Evelyn was cleaning the dishes when she heard a crash in the living room. She rushed in and froze. Caroline stood there, holding the torn painting of her father, the one that used to hang above the fireplace. Pieces of broken glass were scattered on the floor. "You don't belong here anymore," Caroline said, her voice cold and steady. Evelyn's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, but no words came out. Madison stood beside her mother, arms crossed, watching with a faint smile. Evelyn picked up a piece of the broken frame, her hands shaking. That night, she cried quietly on her mattress in the kitchen, feeling more alone than ever. The next morning, while cleaning Caroline's study, Evelyn found an old key stuck inside one of the drawers. She didn't know why, but something inside her told her to keep it. Late that night, when the house went silent, she tiptoed upstairs toward her father's old office, the room that had been locked since the funeral. Her heart pounded as she turned the key. It fit perfectly. The air inside was dusty, but it still smelled faintly of her father's cologne. His books were untouched, and papers were stacked neatly on his desk. She ran her fingers over the surface, remembering how he used to sit there, smiling up at her from his chair. Then she noticed a small wooden box at the back of a drawer. Inside were several sealed letters tied together with a faded ribbon. Her father's handwriting was on each envelope, and one of them had her name on it. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. Before she could open it, a light flicked on behind her. "What do you think you're doing?" Caroline's voice echoed through the room. Evelyn froze, clutching the letter to her chest. Caroline stormed forward, snatched the papers from her hand, and threw them into the fireplace. "You have no right to go through his things," she shouted. Evelyn tried to grab them back, but Caroline pushed her hard. The letters burned quickly, the ink turning to ash before her eyes. "You're done here," Caroline hissed. "Get out." Evelyn was thrown out into the rain that night. The cold soaked through her clothes as she stood outside the locked doors, shivering. The only home she had ever known had turned against her. She looked up at the windows, hoping Caroline would have a shred of mercy, but none came. As thunder rolled across the sky, Evelyn whispered, "You promised, Dad, you promised." And for the first time, she felt that promise slip away completely. After being thrown out of the mansion, Evelyn had nowhere to go. Her clothes were soaked, and her shoes squished with every step. She spent that night under the bus stop shelter, hugging herself for warmth. By morning, her body ached, and her eyes burned from crying. She didn't have much money, just a few dollars she had hidden in her pocket. So, she decided to find work, anything that would help her survive. She walked for miles until she found a small diner on the edge of town. The smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the air. The owner, an older woman named Linda, looked at her with pity when she asked for a job. "You look like you've been through hell, sweetheart," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Evelyn nodded, too tired to explain. Linda offered her a job washing dishes and cleaning tables for a few hours each day. The pay was small, but it was enough to buy food and stay in a tiny room above the diner. The days passed slowly. Evelyn worked quietly, trying not to think about the mansion or the people who had thrown her out. Still, sometimes when the door opened, she'd glance up, half hoping her father would walk in like nothing had happened. But he never did. Instead, one rainy afternoon, a tall man in a gray suit entered. He looked out of place among the clatter of plates and the smell of frying bacon. His sharp eyes scanned the room until they landed on her. "Miss Evelyn Brooks?" he asked. His tone was calm but serious. Evelyn froze, unsure if she should answer. She wiped her hands on her apron and nodded slowly. "Yes, that's me." The man introduced himself as Mr. Harris, her father's lawyer. Hearing her father's name made her heart race. "Your father left some important instructions before he passed," he said softly. "They were meant only for you." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. The paper looked old but carefully kept. Evelyn stared at it, her hands trembling. "There must be a mistake," she whispered. "Caroline handled everything after the funeral." Mr. Harris's expression tightened. "I know," he said quietly, "but your father made specific arrangements to ensure you received this directly. It took some time for me to locate you." Evelyn hesitated before taking the envelope. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Her name was written in her father's handwriting, bold and steady. She traced the letters with her fingers, fighting the lump in her throat. "Did he say what it's about?" she asked. Mr. Harris shook his head. "No, Miss Evelyn. He only said it would explain everything." For a long moment, she just stared at the envelope. The noise of the diner faded around her. Her heart beat fast as she realized this might hold the truth her stepmother tried to hide. Finally, she looked up at Mr. Harris, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you. I've been waiting for something like this." As he left, Evelyn sat at the corner table, the envelope resting in her hand. For the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't felt since her father died: hope. Evelyn waited until her shift ended before she opened the envelope. The diner was quiet, and only the hum of the refrigerator filled the air. She sat alone at one of the corner tables, her hands shaking as she broke the seal. Inside, there was a folded letter written in her father's handwriting, the same careful strokes she remembered from the notes he used to leave on the fridge. Her eyes filled with tears before she even started reading. She could almost hear his voice as the words came alive on the page. The letter began with, "My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means I am no longer there to protect you. But I want you to know, I never left you without a home." She pressed the paper to her chest, her heart aching. When she continued reading, the next lines made her freeze. "I've signed a new version of my will and filed it with Mr. Harris before my passing. No one is to mistreat my daughter in her own home. The Westwood estate belongs to her, fully and unconditionally." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't move. She read the same lines again, just to be sure she wasn't dreaming. Her father had given her everything, the house, the estate, the security she thought she had lost. And all this time, Caroline had known. It hit her like a wave of cold air. The way Caroline had thrown her out, the way she locked the study and destroyed his letters, it was all to hide this truth. Evelyn's hands clenched around the paper. She remembered the night the portrait came down, the cruel smile on Caroline's face, the way she said, "You don't belong here anymore." Now Evelyn finally understood why. Caroline wasn't just cruel, she was afraid. Evelyn wiped her tears and folded the letter carefully. She knew what she had to do. The truth couldn't stay hidden any longer. Her father had trusted her to find this, and she wasn't going to let him down. She placed the letter back into the envelope and tucked it safely into her bag. Her hands were still shaking, but this time it wasn't fear. It was anger mixed with determination. When Mr. Harris returned the next morning to check on her, she showed him the letter. His eyes softened with sympathy, but there was also something else, relief. "I was hoping you'd find it," he said quietly. "Your father wanted justice to be on your side." Evelyn nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "She hid everything from me. She made me believe I had nothing." Mr. Harris looked at her firmly. "Then it's time she learns the truth." Evelyn stood up straighter, feeling the weight of her father's words in her heart. For weeks she had lived like a ghost in her own home. But now, she wasn't that scared, broken girl anymore. She finally had proof, and she was ready to take back everything that was rightfully. The day of the meeting came faster than Evelyn expected. Mr. Harris called her early in the morning and told her everything was ready. Her stomach twisted with nerves, but she knew there was no turning back now. It was time to face Caroline and bring the truth into the open. She dressed simply, her hands trembling as she buttoned her coat. The drive back to the Westwood estate felt endless. Every mile carried memories, laughter, her father's voice, the smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings, all buried under the pain of what had happened since he died. When she finally stepped out of the car, the mansion stood before her just as grand and cold as she remembered. The iron gates creaked open, and for a moment, Evelyn hesitated. The last time she had walked out of this place, it was in the rain, with nothing but a blanket and a broken heart. Now, she was returning with the truth in her hands. Inside, the house was spotless, but it felt lifeless. Caroline was already waiting in the sitting room, dressed elegantly in pearls and a sharp smile. Madison sat beside her, arms crossed, looking annoyed. The sight of them made Evelyn's chest tighten, but she kept her head high. Mr. Harris followed close behind, carrying a brown folder filled with legal papers. "Well," Caroline said, her tone cold and clipped, "I hope this little drama won't take long. Some of us have lives to get back to." Evelyn didn't respond. She just stood quietly as Mr. Harris opened the folder and placed a few documents on the polished table. "Mrs. Brooks," he began, his voice calm but firm, "this meeting concerns the official will of the late Mr. Jonathan Brooks." Caroline's smile faltered slightly. "We already settled the estate," she snapped. "There's no need to go over that again." Mr. Harris adjusted his glasses. "Actually, the document you handled was not the final version. Mr. Brooks filed a new will shortly before his passing, one that changes ownership of the Westwood estate entirely." For a second, no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the... Caroline's hand twitched, and her eyes darted toward Evelyn. "She's lying," she hissed. "That girl is trying to steal what's mine." Evelyn stayed silent, her heart pounding as Mr. Harris pulled out the signed and stamped papers. He slid them across the table toward Caroline. "These are the official documents, verified by the court. According to Mr. Brooks's final will, the estate, assets, and property belong to Miss Evelyn Brooks, fully and unconditionally." Caroline's face went pale. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Madison leaned forward, shaking her head. "That can't be real," she muttered. "It's real," Mr. Harris said firmly. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice steady. "You took everything from me. You made me believe I was nothing. But this house, it was always mine." Caroline tried to stand tall, but her hands were trembling. The confidence she once carried slipped away as the truth settled between them like heavy air. Evelyn didn't smile or gloat. She just looked around the room, breathing in the faint scent of her father's cologne, and whispered to herself, "I'm home." Mr. Harris began to read the will slowly and clearly. Every word echoed through the quiet room, and Evelyn could feel the weight of each sentence. Caroline sat stiffly in her chair, her jaw tight, while Madison kept fidgeting beside her. The moment Mr. Harris read the first line, that the Westwood estate, all funds, and every business share were legally owned by Evelyn Brooks, the entire room seemed to freeze. For a long time, no one spoke. The sound of papers shifting was the only thing that broke the silence. Evelyn's heart pounded, but she stayed still, her eyes fixed on the letterhead that carried her father's name. Mr. Harris continued, his voice steady. "This will fully replaces any earlier versions and grants sole ownership to my daughter, Evelyn Brooks." Caroline's face turned pale. Her hands, which had been clasped neatly in her lap, began to tremble. "No," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. "That's impossible. He wouldn't do that." Madison stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "That can't be right," she shouted. "My mom took care of him. She deserves this." Mr. Harris didn't even flinch. He adjusted his glasses and said, "The signatures have been verified by 2 witnesses, and the court has already confirmed its authenticity." He handed the documents to Caroline, who snatched them with trembling fingers. Her eyes darted across the lines, desperate to find a mistake, anything that would prove this was wrong. But the truth was staring her in the face. Evelyn sat quietly, watching her stepmother unravel. She thought about all the nights she had spent in the cold kitchen, sleeping beside the stove, treated like she didn't belong. The same woman who had made her scrub floors, serve food, and live like a servant had been living off money that was never hers to begin with. The irony hit hard, and so did the justice. Caroline's voice cracked as she tried to speak. "He must have changed it without telling me," she said weakly. "He was sick. He didn't know what he was doing." Mr. Harris looked at her firmly. "Mrs. Brooks, your husband was in full control of his decision. He made this choice knowingly and deliberately." Evelyn could see the truth settling in. Madison sank back into her seat, speechless for once. Caroline looked smaller than Evelyn had ever seen her. Not the cold, powerful woman who once ruled the house, but a frightened person who finally realized everything she had stolen was gone. For the first time, Evelyn spoke, her tone calm but firm. "You took everything from me, my room, my peace, my home. But you couldn't take what was already mine." No one replied. The silence in the room was heavy, but it wasn't painful anymore. It felt freeing. Evelyn finally had what her father had promised her. Not just the house, but the truth. She sat back, feeling a strange calm wash over her. Caroline lowered her head, unable to meet her eyes. Evelyn looked around the room one last time, at the grand furniture, the polished floors, the walls that once felt like a cage, and realized she wasn't the powerless girl who used to live in the kitchen anymore. She was the rightful owner of the Westwood estate. Everything Caroline had built her comfort on now belonged back where it should have been all along, with her. Evelyn didn't say much after Mr. Harris finished reading the will. She sat quietly, her fingers folded in her lap, letting the silence speak for her. Caroline's face was still pale, and Madison looked like she was on the edge of tears. For years, they had both made her feel small, powerless, and unwanted. But now, everything had turned around. Evelyn finally had the power, and she didn't need to raise her voice to use it. When Mr. Harris gathered the last of the papers and left the room, the air grew heavier. Caroline stood up suddenly, trying to recover her pride. "You can't just walk in here and take everything," she said, her voice trembling but sharp. "I've lived in this house for years. I made this a home." Evelyn looked at her calmly. "You made it your home by throwing me out of mine," she said softly. "This house was always mine. You knew that." Caroline's lips trembled. "You're just a child. You don't understand how things work. You can't survive here alone." Evelyn stood up, meeting her eyes. "I've already survived worse than this. You made sure of that." There was no anger in her tone, only quiet strength. Caroline tried a different approach. She softened her voice and took a step closer. "Evelyn, we can work something out. You don't have to do this. Think about what your father would want." Evelyn's heart tightened at the mention of her father, but she didn't let her emotions control her. "He wanted me to be treated with respect," she said. "He wanted me to have a home. You made sure I had neither." The color drained from Caroline's face again. "Please," she whispered. "Where will I go?" Evelyn looked around the room. The same room where Caroline had once ordered her to clean floors and serve food. Now the roles were reversed. She took a slow breath and said quietly, "You have 1 week to leave. I'm not your maid anymore." Madison jumped to her feet. "You can't kick us out," she yelled. "You think you're better than us now?" Evelyn didn't even look at her. "I don't think I'm better," she replied calmly, "but I know what's mine." Caroline's face twisted with anger. "You'll regret this," she snapped. "You'll be alone here with nothing but ghosts." Evelyn didn't flinch. "I've lived with ghosts before," she said. "They're kinder than you." Caroline stood frozen, not knowing what to say. Madison grabbed her arm, whispering something under her breath, but Evelyn didn't care to listen. She turned and walked toward the staircase. Her footsteps were steady, each one a reminder of the strength she had gained from every night spent on that cold kitchen floor. By the time she reached the landing, she stopped and looked back once. Caroline was standing in the middle of the room, her eyes filled with disbelief. Evelyn didn't feel anger or joy, just peace. She had her home back, her father's memory protected, and her dignity restored. Her revenge didn't need shouting or cruelty. It was enough that Caroline had to face the truth, that the girl she had tried to break had risen above her without even raising her voice. A month passed, and the Westwood estate was finally quiet again. The house that had once felt like a cage now felt peaceful, almost warm. Evelyn walked through the halls every morning, the sunlight spilling across the polished floors, and for the first time in years, she felt at home. Caroline and Madison were gone, just as she had told them to be. They left the house in silence, and Evelyn didn't watch them go. She didn't need to. That chapter of her life had already closed. With the help of a few workers, Evelyn began restoring the house. She wanted to bring it back to how her father had kept it, filled with life and comfort. The first thing she did was restore his portrait. It had been hidden away in the attic, the frame cracked and dusty. She cleaned it herself, wiping every corner gently until his face looked clear again. Then she hung it back over the fireplace where it belonged. When she stepped back to look at it, her throat tightened. "You're home again, Dad," she whispered. The kitchen was next. For so long, that room had been a place of sadness, where she had cried, worked, and slept on the cold floor. But she didn't want to erase it. She wanted to change it. The walls were repainted a warm cream color, and she replaced the old stove with a modern one. She added plants by the window and placed a small dining table in the... When it was done, she stood there smiling, remembering the nights she had stared out of that same window, wishing for a different... Now that life was finally hers. The neighbors, who had once believed Caroline's lies, started visiting again. They were curious and polite, pretending they had always supported Evelyn. "We heard you took over the estate," one woman said, sipping tea in the living room. "What happened to Caroline and Madison?" Evelyn smiled gently, not giving away anything. "They moved out," she said simply. There was no need for more explanation. She didn't want revenge stories or gossip. She had found her peace, and that was enough. At night, when the house grew quiet, Evelyn would sit by the fireplace with a cup of tea and look up at her father's portrait. The light from the fire made it seem like he was smiling down at her. She often thought about the promise he had made, that she would always have a home. It had taken time, pain, and courage, but that promise had finally come true. Evelyn no longer felt like the girl who used to sleep beside the stove. She was stronger now, calm, proud, and free. The mansion wasn't just a place she owned. It was a part of her story, a symbol of everything she had survived. As the wind rustled through the trees outside, she whispered softly, "You kept your word, Dad." And deep down, she knew he was listening. The evening sky was painted in soft shades of orange and pink as Evelyn stood on the balcony of the Westwood estate. The same balcony where her father used to stand, looking over the wide fields that stretched endlessly into the horizon. The wind brushed through her hair as she looked out at the land that once felt so far from her reach. Now it was all hers, not because she fought with anger, but because she never gave up on what was rightfully her own. The house behind her was quiet, filled only with the sounds of calm. No shouting, no footsteps filled with cruelty, no laughter meant to hurt her. Everything was still. She leaned against the railing, her eyes soft but strong. For the first time in a long while, her heart didn't feel heavy. It felt full. She thought of her father's smile, his voice, and the way he always told her, "You'll always have a home here, no matter what." Evelyn whispered into the wind, "You were right, Dad. No one could take this from me." The words felt powerful, almost freeing. She knew he couldn't answer, but she could feel his presence around her, in the light breeze, in the warmth of the setting sun, in the quiet peace that finally surrounded the estate. She thought about everything she had been through, the nights she slept on the kitchen floor, the tears she tried to hide, the cruel words that echoed through the halls. Those memories used to haunt her, but now they were just pieces of her story. Painful, yes, but also proof of her strength. She had faced everything with quiet endurance, never lowering herself to hate or revenge. That was what made her victory different. Her revenge didn't come from shouting or punishment. It came from truth, the truth her stepmother tried to bury. It came from the strength to stand tall and take back what was hers with dignity. Evelyn realized that sometimes, the best revenge isn't destruction, it's peace. It's showing that no matter how deeply someone tries to break you, they can't take away who you are. As the sun began to dip below the trees, Evelyn smiled softly. The Westwood estate no longer felt like a memory of pain. It was a symbol of freedom. The girl who once slept beside a cold stove now stood above it all, calm and unbroken. She turned to go back inside, her steps slow and peaceful. The house glowed gently under the evening light, the walls holding her father's warmth once again. For a long moment, she looked around and whispered one last time, "Thank you for believing in me." Then she closed the balcony doors behind her, leaving the world outside to the sound of the wind and the quiet triumph of a girl who had finally taken back her home.